Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm going to have a conversation with my great friend Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi, everybody. This is Trent. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and the late medieval China. I'm also based in Austin, Texas. Glad to be with y'all.
What we are going to do today in this episode is that we kind of come to a concluding point of the first, maybe like stage of our inquiry into the nature of, or the inquiry into the concept of human nature, which, broadly speaking, can be summarized by referring to evolution biology. And what we have done so far is that we have thought about human nature within the context of evolution biology, whether the concept of human nature can survive the post-evolutionary world of science, or we need to give up the concept of human nature and supplant it with something quite different that doesn't have any form of substantial persistence that exists in a lot of um, pre-19th century accounts of human nature in the Western philosophy. Um, what we have explored has shown us that there is a way to do so. There is a way to keep the concept of human nature if we give up the idea that human nature equals human essence, and if we think about human essence as something that is very strictly like persistent and like just unchanging throughout time. Um, so the whole conversation we have been having has been about like the concept of human nature without human essence, and what does that tell us? How we can incorporate the fundamental principles of evolution in change and transformation and appearance and disappearance, and still meaningfully talk about human nature. We talked about Grant Ramsey, and Grant Ramsey talked about a lot of other viewpoints that exist within the post-evolutionary world of philosophy of biology. And his Ramsey's perspective is subsumed under the trait cluster account of human nature. And we've spent a lot of time talking about that. I'm not going to go into the details of that. While discussing that, which is a lot about causally sustained relations between traits at any given time and the probability of flexibility of those traits, we ran into some problems. One of those problems was the concept of the trait itself and how much this kind of a snapshot view of traits as they are linked can be actually expounding to us what human nature is. And in facing with some of the problems that we encountered in Ramsey, we talked about two other figures in details, Dupré and Griffiths. And both of these develop accounts that are basically sympathetic to Ramsey's approach, but emphasize on elements that are absent or unpronounced in Ramsey. An important element there is the developmental aspect of humanity and the process, or not just humanity, developmental aspect of a species. And um, what this developmental approach can give us is something beyond that kind of a snapshot view of traits, something beyond the causal links that Ramsey has in mind, and kind of give us a system within which every entity, including the species, is not just existing in the here and now with some kind of links between their traits, but it's coming from somewhere and going somewhere, and how that all of those relations matter in understanding the nature of a species and its propensity to change and sustaining itself. What we want to do here, as we discussed last time, there are differences between Griffiths and Dupré in this in their approach in understanding this developmental idea. We want to both look at like Griffiths and Dupré, or like through our engagement with these thinkers, we think we now have resources to make some moves in our conception of human nature through reconsidering the concept of trait. Right? Basically, the discussion that we've had about Ramsey, Griffiths, and Dupré, and the relationship that Dupré and Griffiths have with each other, and the way that they are different from one another, and how they both are different from Ramsey, give us an opportunity to go back to the concept of trait, reconstruct the idea of the trait, and with that reconsideration, kind of like open doors for further inquiry into the concept of human nature. We're going to do that through 4 metaphors. And I'm going to talk about 2 of them. Trent is going to talk about 2 of them. Before doing that, Trent, do you have anything to add to this introduction?
No, I think the only thing I want to like emphasize is so I personally believe the reason we spend so much time quote unquote criticizing Ramsey's cluster trade cluster theory is at least I see a lot of value and potential in or importance in the concept of trade, which really help us to bridge um, different disciplines because like it's essentially the relation between individual and universal pattern recognizing. Can we perhaps parallel evolution of say culture with the evolution of species, just put it in most commonsensical categories. So with that said, I think we just go into our form metaphors or parables, whatever, and to show our listeners like what we uh, are not satisfied, entirely persuaded by that model.
Yes. So these are our 4 metaphors or examples, whatever you want to think about, however you want to think about them. Kidneys, lichens, legends, and criminals. These examples want to tell us, want to show us how interestingly we can kind of create our understanding of traits and kind of escape from this idea that traits are these elements that are just existing in the world and just like we just go there and find their one-on-one links, and how this reconsideration is going to push us to pursue maybe very different approaches than Ramsey in understanding the world of traits. I will start with kidneys. The thing about kidneys that I think is very important is that if you take a kidney out of a human body and put it in a lab and bring someone who hasn't seen a kidney but has like tools for scientific inquiry, right, to analyze kidney, you can get a lot of traits out of kidney, right? You can see like what we can make a list of the traits that exist in this entity in front of you. And that is true. That is not something that is not that you can find the causal links between different elements that exist within a kidney, right? And I mean, I'm not sure how kidneys work, but there are some human organs that you can kind of artificially make them like, pump some, like think about heart. You can create an artificial system of pumping, and you can just say, oh, okay, like this is like a pumping system, right? Maybe you can do something similar to kidneys, and you can see some of its, some of see kidney in action, quote unquote, in a lab context without a human body being present. No matter how accurate those observations about kidneys are, however, if you're not thinking about kidneys in relation to a human body as a function, as a functional part of a human body, there is something very important missing about kidneys. Kidneys, as free floating objects in the world, have traits. Those traits have relationship with one another, but outside the system of relation beyond themselves, we are very limited in our understanding what kidneys are. Right? And what we wonder here is that kidney to human being to its environment, for instance, right? And this environment could mean many things, not just like natural inhabitant, but like cultural setup, right? If you isolate a human being and like look at it as an individual and like look at the traits, it's not like an amalgamation. Like to understand the function of an organ, you don't putting the organs side by side, decimated and like distinct from one another, is not going to help you. You need to look at how the whole system together works. You know, atomistic approach to understanding kidneys is going to be very limited. It's going to give you a very limited approach, limited information about what kidneys are. So we think about traits in humanity, about the relationship not just with human beings with their environment in the natural sense, but with other human beings and the whole body of the system of existence, biological existence and cultural existence and physical existence. And what the way that we want to approach traits is that not to give it as like a given thing as a kidney in the lab, but to try to see how this given thing could be connected within the whole system. And we don't see that much in Ramsey's approach. Now it's time for lichens. Trent.
Yes, yes. This example of likeness is inspired by Griffith's emphasis on the necessary condition of survival for thinking about evolutionary biology. So let's imagine like a rock in the Pacific that is like habited by a group of lichens, two of them actually. And rock one, the lichen has the capacity to change its environment by, say, emitting certain acid into the rock and gradually makes it into kind of a soil and also increase its acidity. The other one does the same. At this point, there's no difference. But over, say, a century, when the rocks become sufficiently acid, the initial lichen can no longer survive in acid soil, and then on rock one, it dies out. And the whole land was later on invaded by a type of grass which can survive or can thrive on acid soil. And the rock two, that lichens mutated and developed a certain like protein, whatever, or gene that is also shared with that invasive grass on rock one that allows them to survive on the on the rock. So comparing these two rocks, current state of trait cluster correlation using Ramsey's model, you will get exactly the same result. You have a specific condition of the rock named acid soil, and also certain gene or like ability, natural ability to survive on this. But one is still kind of lichen, the other is grass already. So the history of evolution, the history of the species' ability to change environment and later on perhaps evolve in relation to that change is flattened by that cluster theory, which is significant because we are interested in human nature, not just as a snapshot. We're interested in the human capacity of like maintaining such a process. So we're not just interested in cluster of traits. So just using that to explain the human nature and taking out the change and the capacity to react to the change is fundamentally incomplete, to say the least, if not misleading. So you have something to say?
Yes, I think that's very good. I just wanted to clarify something. Could we say in what you're saying about lichens that we don't know what a trait means unless we know its history, and that's why the snapshot model doesn't make sense. Because like in the case of the kidneys, what I was suggesting was that we don't know what an entity is unless we know it as part of a system, right?
Yeah.
In that sense, a biological system.
Yes.
In the case of lichens, you are taking this to like the temporal element. We don't know what traits mean in a environmental context.
Yeah. Yeah,
unless we know how they come about and where they're going.
yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very good point because Gordon Ramsay emphasizes they are causally related, but he's not talking about the relationship between time and causality, and that matters when you talk about speciation, evolution, or like human nature. That
Mhm.
you cannot take traits out of time. He does have a place for time, but it's not in the same as part of causality. His causality, his law of causality is atemporal. Like time only matters to individual life cycle or life history. So it's in the collective sense beyond the individual contingent life. If you introduce generation and ancestry, that model becomes incomplete. I think I agree with you. History matters. This example somehow shows. I don't know. The third one is about the legends. That one is prompted by Ramsey's a comment that his book is not about human theories of human nature, which you can easily think about. It's a Christian story about human nature, Buddhist story about human nature. He said that those are great, but it's irrelevant to the picture. If they feature at all, they're just like manifestation of one particular trait of a human being, namely imagination or storytelling, whatever. However, once you borrow insights from both Dupre as well as Griffiths, you will recognize that such storytelling or legend making, myth making capacity itself is fundamental to human existence as it stands, because we are in a very sophisticated large scale society where symbolic communication is necessary for the redistribution of resources, and hence you can have a whole cluster of millions of people living in one city without which does not even produce its own food, which is unthinkable without that long-term trade as well as the communication system. So the foundation of this, I would say, is culture matters or stories matter in a sense like way beyond Graham Ramsey's model would acknowledge or tolerate. And so they are not just an isolated trait, but rather they are kind of manifestation or the substantiation of the developmental niche or the processes which interact with more measurable and more observable in their framework processes that made human existence as it stands possible. So in that sense, by just reducing it to a trait really misses the importance of culture, even though it does not interact with other parts of the human body in the same way a kidney, say, does with other part of a human organisms. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. And I think it's important also in the way that, like, when we are thinking about, like, Dupre's problem with, like, evolutionary psychologists, right? And, like, thinking that you can go to a fixed feature of humanity, infer all the rest from that specific point. I think a similar thing in a weird way happens in Ramsey when he says that, look, it's important that we have imagination, but all these, like, particular, uh, you know, imaginary stories about human nature, they do not matter. The trait is imagination and storytelling. The
Right.
stories do not matter. And I think that's a very important point to kind of like see how someone's like Dupre's position
Mm.
come like head on with Ramsey, because if those stories about what we are put us in different developmental trajectories, and then now that completely new features of humanity starts to kind of come to the foreground, then of course it matters. Like it's even if we are thinking about it in terms of the snapshot view of humanity, right? Even in the snapshot picture of humanity, the legends and myths and the stories that exist within that snapshot are causally relevant in making sense of what traits are around, right? The legends are causally relevant, and if what Ramsey cares about is causal relations between traits, then legends matter. And if legends matter, then that's its own, like you open a door that is just, it's going to be very hard to close, right? It's just because then all misrepresentations and false thoughts are also in the game of human nature. Not just because we make mistakes as a generic statement about humanity or we have imagination, but because our quote unquote false thoughts or weird imaginations put us on different developmental trajectories and causally constrain us. In like Griffith's language is exogenetic, maybe, right? If you want to like have the cake view, those exogenetic constraints really determine the developmental trajectories that we're part of. Therefore, it's going to really influence the traits that we expose at a given time. So even if we remain within the snapshot view of Ramsey, of course it matters that we have this all sorts of like viewpoints about human nature, just like all sorts of other stories that we have. You cannot just like bracket and say that, oh, we've been religious, but yeah, we are a religious animal, but yeah, we can just bracket that. No, 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 no. If you're a religious animal, or we have expressed that element, that has put us in like lines of existence that has been causally relevant to what we are now as this species. You cannot just like shrug them off and just stay at a generic level of that. Oh yeah, it's religious, it's imagination. No, that's not gonna do the job. Okay, so I'm gonna finish this up with the concept of criminals. The way that I'm thinking about this concept is very much about the way I'm thinking about Kant's moral theory. And we have talked about this when we talked about Julian Rose. And basically, the idea that like the part of it that is important is that for Kant, when you want to decide whether an action is moral or not, I want to, get some money from Tren. I will tell him that I'm going to give it back to him in 2 months. I want the money to get some, I will tell him I need it for a medical bill, but I really want to buy him, a ticket to Cancun. And, I will just get the money, go to Cancun, never give him back the money, right? Now, if
This
you
is a
want
true
to,
story, by the way.
yeah, true adjacent. Um, in this kind of a scenario, the question for Kant is, okay, let's see if this is a moral action or not. Now, if you want to see if it's a moral action or not, you basically need to think about this in its universal form. And when you're thinking about it in a universal form, you kind of like detach it from specificities of this case. For instance, it doesn't matter that it's me and Trent, right? It could be any other person. Because Kant wants to say that, like, for instance, special relations do not matter, right? If it's moral to save a drowning person, it doesn't matter who that drowning person is, right? That's basically the idea. You need to kind of detach special desires and attachments that individuals have to check the moral value of a given act. Okay. So when we're thinking about this case of a specific case of lending money, asking for money and lying about it, you just need to think about it in this kind of a very, very broad way, right? And then, you see whether you can imagine a word that works that way. We don't need to care about that, but that stage of it is important, right? The thing is, and this has been a consistent criticism of Kant, that when you detach actions from such specificities, you lose track of what those actions really are, right? And you keep like finding yourself in awkward scenarios where like you're gonna say, oh no, 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 don't detach that much, detach this much, so that you don't run into very odd scenarios that like playing tennis is immoral. Like you need to add certain things, reintroduce certain context to see whether an action is moral or not. The same idea I think is happening when we like, think about like some kind of people who are critical of the social justice system, right? Or like the criminal system in a country like the US, right? Like you say, like for the longest time, for instance, like different types of people have been called criminals just because they were just protesting some form of injustice, right? That's happened. Just like all sorts of people have been called like women, especially throughout history, have been like described as like insane or kind of like possessed or like even like being a witch, like these types of statements have been attached to individuals. Now, if someone is a kind of a critical of like how we name people within a society, then they can go on and tell us about a system within which this person is presented, right? And this is not always just about like, misdiagnosis of a scientist, but like kind of putting in the context that, hey, we have called this person a criminal, but look at this condition. Like, this person has been enslaved and is like dying from hunger and is stealing like a piece of bread to just eat and survive under these miserable conditions. Definitely cannot just put this in the same category as someone is just like making, fraudulent financial, manipulations to gain $1 million and buy a yacht and go to Pacific Ocean, right? Um, by this, I mean that any sort of detachment of kind of socio-political context um, also turns traits into kind of empty words. The same way that kidneys without bodies are very limited. We can have a very limited understanding of kidneys if we don't understand them in relation to human bodies. Human traits are also the same if they're not if not understood within like socio-political systems. I'm mentioning this because I don't see a very like intense interest in someone like Ramsey that, oh, now let's go and like think about socio-political systems that human beings are part of. That's not how the book ends, right? The book doesn't tell you that, now this tells us that if we want to understand what these traits are and how they're causally linked, we need to kind of understand what a socio-political sphere even is. There's no mention of that. And that makes me very suspicious about like that kind of understanding of traits. Because I think traits, as we have said, both within only have meaning within biological systems as historical elements, including imaginary conceptions as causal links, and also within a larger cultural, social, and political systems, right? I think all of these elements are necessary for even beginning to think about traits.
I just quite one quick response to your criminal thought experiment. I think it's really neat. I think that points out that causality works in this system, not just a correlating force among traits themselves, but also between traits and certain systems that are not reducible to individual traits. So you mentioned like the legal system or like a social political system, and those are not represented by the trait of having a president. Because you cannot just reduce, say, the current, say, U.S. political system into one specific office or one specific trait as readily recognized, but it's rather the way of generating traits and correlating, correcting traits within the system, and the trait of, say, having prison, whatever, is related to this whole system instead of just any other isolated office, like say police enforcement, law enforcement, whatever. That really misses the point of the whole like recognizing and the way how a individual trait influence what do we see as a human being and what sometimes we exclude a human being from personhood, whatever. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And these are going to be like these kind of like this reconstruction that we have presented to you guys based on these examples is going to be presented in what is going to come next and in our engagement later. What we want to acknowledge before ending this episode is that what we see, like there are elements that we see still unresolved in Ramsey, in Griffiths, and in Dupré. And these are the elements that in different, like, we're going to get back to these. Um, and these are elements that are important. And of course, every one of them is not as isolated problem. It gets connected to a whole range of other problems. One of the main things that we think is still unresolved and even, neglected is the question of speciation, right? Which in a way is just kind of like a special case of the universal individual problem. All of these people seem to think that it's already clear who is a human being, right? Which is a weird thing to say for people who are trying to kind of understand human nature. Like they seem to have a naive, realist view of speciation as they discuss human nature. Maybe they have an idea somewhere else of like what the speciation is, but Ramsey explicitly is uninterested in the question. Doesn't say that, yeah, we don't have a problem with like recognizing a human being when they would put them like among monkeys and giraffes. So it's just that clear who a human being is. The problem is not identification. The problem is characterization. But that's not an answer to the question of speciation, because some people would argue that this whole idea of human nature is vacuous because there is no real boundaries between species. Because like that identifiers that we use are very much biased and incomplete, and the boundaries we make between a species is just something that we need to abandon. Um, so this point about speciation and how the relationship between individual members and a species, right? What a single developmental trajectory of a society gets related to the whole species. That's another way to think about it. Those are the questions that are not really answered. We are not presented with a philosophical system within which individual trajectories, societal trajectories in terms of developments and unfolding of certain characteristics gets related under the more umbrella term of human nature. That is still lacking. That universal individual logic is still missing for us. Secondly, the issue of the culture and nature, which has been on the foreground, is still unresolved for us. And it seems like we mentioned the point about cake model and cocktail model. Cake model would suggest that, well, here's nature, here's culture, they're interacting, but they're different. The cocktail model want to say that the distinction itself is not something tenable. But in both of these cases, we're going to have problems, or we're still unsettled about how we need to kind of think about the traits. Because if you get rid of the distinction altogether, there are some uninteresting consequences of that. Because something like presence of genes seem to be very important in humanity, and you cannot just take it away and just like you pretend that it doesn't exist. But any sort of analysis that wants to create a strict distinction between the two also seems to not function well. So that's going to be definitely something that we are going to emphasize on our future conversations. Trent, any response to those, and you can introduce us to the last problem, and then
No, I
we can
don't
finish.
have any response to the 2 points that you covered. Yes, we're definitely not satisfied with the current explanations offered, and we'll keep thinking with those questions. The final one is my personal long long-standing struggle with the concept of time, which is really intimately connected with the concept of causality, as this whole endeavor has made very clear. For Ramsey, it's clear time is rather irrelevant to the concept of causally constrained. And then with the Lichens whatever experiment, I hope I have made it clear that it's history matters, and the fact that a certain, unless you make sense of the temporal contexts of a trait, you cannot make sense either of its individual function to that species, or its relationship with other traits. So just to understand causality or causally constrained relationship among traits at any given point, you must consider the cumulative process of how such correlation came to be. And Griffiths tried to extend this by introducing like ancestry, which is to a certain extent a species' natural generational time of reproduction. So individual life cycle became connected with a species' collective self-reproduction. And that's a huge step forward. But time there is kind of, how to put it, it's only used as a context. It's not a participant of the causality itself. That we can use time to measure how does a group of members of the same species acquire a certain capacity or adapt to the nature, and which kind of constantly fulfill its necessary conditions of survival. But that thing is not, for instance, the species, like say human beings, temporal consciousness is meaningless to human biological reproduction in this model. However, if the creation of certain standard temporal calendars enable, say, long-distance trade and mechanical reproduction of resources, that it already changes it human individuals' consciousness of time participated in the way certain traits of capacity of a society became sustainable. That so time and causality, they are not separable in that sense. So I'm personally seeing most potential perhaps in Jean Dubray's processual model, because that one seems to me overlapping with system theory of being or a society in general. And time, according to that system theory, is produced within individual systems and correlate and helps the system to couple with or correlate with other systems. So translate this into biological terms, perhaps is the niche is precisely that time converter, for instance, in interacting with numerous external factors at different scales, could be molecule, could be like really gigantic climatic or ecological scale, but they all operated at a different temporal scheme or scale. But to turn all those external factors into meaningful information for this species to sustain maintenance and self reproduction is, I think, very important mechanism, perhaps very central to Dubray's concept of process of maintaining that trajectory. So I think time matters not just as an external measurement of to connect different snapshots together as a moving picture, but rather a active agent or participant in this causality making process, if that makes sense, if at the species level. When we're talking about the human nature, time cannot be bracketed out just as a external thing. It's very much like a legend. Human perception, theories of time also mattered for the way social communication is unfolded and human possibilities are restrained or enabled. Yes, that's my.
That's a very interesting. I think that the final point that you make here is very interesting, and it's kind of like, yeah, exactly. Like there's parallels with that whole idea of myth, and I think it's just interesting that for Ramsey it seems like that. Just to make the parallel. Just I'm not saying that he's exactly saying that, but the logic of it seems this way. That you go ahead, you find what objectively time is, and that's what it is. That's what is the agent of influence in causally connecting things, right? Um, but if you're kind of thinking about this from this developmental trajectory approach, definitely different understanding of time within human societies, you know, hinders access to certain developmental trajectories and opens doors to others, right? Um, and all of that could happen without any sort of correlation between that time and quote unquote objective time, whatever that is, right? Or like some sort of abstracted version of time that kind of like takes away all of these different temporal orders and like flatten things out into one singular framework. Excellent. I think this is actually a good point to end this conversation. Trent, do you have anything to add?
No, I think we've said all we want to say about what we read so far, but we'll definitely stay with this whole human nature theme, and so stay attuned, listeners. Thanks for like your attention, and we look forward to your comment. If you have any ideas about our interpretation of the three thinkers, feel free to share with us. I really hope I'm sure some of you are like way more knowledgeable than both Aaron and me on like evolution of biology. So we look forward to your insight. So until next time, just take care and thanks for your listening.